Good afternoon. I'm Sam Lovell with Friends of the Detroit River, and welcome everyone to our webinar focusing on coastal wetlands and climate change. This is an extremely broad topic for which we hope to at least introduce several important points of interest. We have an exciting lineup of speakers for you today, including Dr. John Hartig, who is a visiting scholar at University of Windsor's Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research. John also serves on the board of directors of Detroit Riverfront Conservancy and previously served as refuge manager for the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge for 14 years. Next, we have Greg Norwood with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Greg is the ecologist in the stewardship unit of the DNR Parks and Recreation Division, which manages over 300,000 acres of public land across 103 parks and recreation areas in Michigan. He recently served as Michigan DNR's Terrestrial Invasive Species Program Coordinator and was formerly a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where he helped build the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge, the first international refuge in the country. And Terry Heatlie, representing the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who has been working as a contractor for NOAA's Restoration Center in the Great Lakes since 2009. Prior to this, he worked with the Corps of Engineers and an environmental consulting firm. In addition to restoring habitat-related fisheries, he has 34 years of experience in aquatic resource assessment, monitoring, planning, permitting, federal grant review, NEPA compliance, and natural resource damage assessment. Along with our guests, we have Robert Burns and myself, both with Friends of the Detroit River. With a background in marine construction and engineering, Bob Burns acts as technical advisor to our Detroit River habitat restoration projects. He also serves as the Detroit River Keeper and is vice chair to the Detroit River Public Advisory Council. And I'm a landscape architect serving as project manager for our habitat restoration projects. In addition, we have our friends from Michigan State University Extension Conservation Stewardship Program. Bindu Bhakta and Eric Elgin are handling all the technical production to make this webinar happen and are moderating a question and answer session at the end of our presentation. Please know that Greg Norwood and I will be doing a follow-up webinar with Bindu and Eric and MSU Extension on December 8th that will drill down in more detail about habitat restoration and coastal wetlands on Belle Isle. Again, all related to climate change. So Bindu, how about letting everyone know how they can participate in today's webinar and follow up to receive more information? Next.
Thanks, Sam. So today your sound is on mute. So for the duration of the presentation, you'll be on mute. But please do feel free to use the chat function where you can enter any comments or questions for the speakers at any time. So if you have any questions about Zoom or if you have any questions, also please share resources and feel free to also use the chat to send a message to somebody else that's on the that's participating today. So one other note, you do have the option of turning on your camera if you would like, but just note that today's presentation is being recorded. And so in the recording, your photo may be captured. So just keep that in mind if you choose to turn your camera on or off. So I'll turn it back to Sam.
Thanks, Bindu. Okay, so let's get going. Next slide. Scientists have predicted we are in for warmer, wetter, and wilder weather, and this is likely to be one of the greatest environmental challenges of our time. This webinar will take a look at the problem, look at some of the historical occurrences that got us into this mess, discuss a little bit about what we have been doing about the problem lately, and finally, it will discuss some recommendations for the future. To lead things off, Terry Heatlie will give us a quick look at some of the problems. Go ahead, Terry. Next.
Good afternoon, everyone. This combination of higher water levels, more intense storms, and a more frequency of these intense storms has led to impacts to shorelines throughout the Great Lakes. I'm guessing that most of the people on this call have either experienced it directly or at least have seen some photographs of these the impacts of this changing climate. Next. One of those effects, and this is a photo from Detroit, Michigan, has been flooding in areas that maybe people have not experienced flooding in before. Next. On Belle Isle, also in the Detroit River, extensive flooding has occurred throughout the island due to higher than normal, actually unprecedented levels of high water that have flooded not only the wooded sort of natural areas, but roadways, infrastructure on the west end. Tremendous amount of pumping has been taking place and sandbagging to protect some of those areas of infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so other public areas like this boat launch at Elizabeth Park in Grosse Ile and the parking area, these areas have become inundated, and that is also impacting the public use of some of the waterways. Next, please. You can imagine with higher water levels and more intense storms and more frequent storms, this has led to some really severe erosion throughout the Great Lakes. As you can see here with this road on Lake Erie being undercut. Next, please. Other public use areas, this ramp, I believe this was near Ludington, so this is Lake Michigan. The shoreline as well as the ramp. A lot of these man-made structures are experiencing both high water level that they weren't probably designed for, as well as the intensity and frequency of the storms and the energy hitting them. Next, please. And those living right along the shoreline are really seeing some dramatic impacts from this changing climate, where homes are being threatened, like here in Lake Huron. Next slide. And in some cases, you see this dramatic case where houses are actually sliding into the lake. And these are events that cause erosion that happened over a really, really quick period of time. Next, please. It isn't just the human use areas that are impacted. We're seeing impacts to natural resources due to high water levels, as well as the effects of erosion from these frequent and severe storms. Here on Sugar Island, this is also in the Detroit River, mature trees are falling into the river due to erosion of the banks that is happening quickly. Next slide, please. Back to Belle Isle, there's, as I mentioned, that a lot of the island was flooded. Well, this flooding lasted through the growing season, and some of the trees, although they might be able to take some flooding of the roots for a short period of time, when the flooding occurs over an entire growing season, this could have, permanent effects on those forests, and a lot of the trees may end up dying as a result. And with this, I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. For decades, wetlands were often considered wastelands and were poorly understood, but they clearly provide many benefits and values to to not only the ecosystem, but us, because we are part of the ecosystem. Wetlands are called nurseries of life because they provide safe habitat for the young of many fish, birds, and other species. Some 5,000 species of plants are found in wetlands, along with 1/3 of all bird species, 200 species of fish, and 190 species of amphibians. Wetlands provide essential breeding, nesting, resting, feeding, and nursery areas for many threatened and endangered species. They stabilize and maintain the water table by retaining water during dry periods and storing excess water during storm and flood conditions. They also can serve as a living filter system for removing sediment, nutrients, and pollutants. Next slide, please. Wetlands provide protection from storms and ice by absorbing wave energy and buffering the shoreline against erosion. Some function as sites of groundwater recharge, replenishing and purifying the water in aquifers that supply many local wells. On the Detroit River, they provide fish with a unique and increasingly sparse spawning and nursery ground habitats. They also provide recreational opportunities such as hunting, fishing, birding, and kayaking that contribute significantly to our economy. They can also help mitigate and adapt to climate change. They can capture and store carbon, and they act as sponges, temporarily retaining floodwaters and releasing them slowly, thus reducing flood damage. Next slide, please. Here's a picture from the wetlands along Fighting Island and 2 eaglets in a bald eagle's nest. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the largest great blue heron rookery on the Detroit River, Stony Island. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of a mink that is increasingly becoming more common up and down the Detroit River. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of a lake sturgeon. 9 sturgeon spawning reefs have been constructed on the Detroit River, and once these larvae come off the reef, they need wetland habitat, coastal wetlands, to serve as nursery habitat in the Detroit River. Next slide. In many respects, we're in a big cycle, and think of this. Early settlers used wetlands and beaver. They harvested beaver for the fur trade area. Then came shipbuilding history, and Detroit literally led the nation in shipbuilding during the 1890s. That followed by steel making and automobile manufacturing. And now we're coming full circle with the reclaiming of wetlands like you can see at the Refuge Gateway in Trenton, Michigan. Next slide, please. Coastal wetlands mitigate climate change by sequestering carbon and preventing release into the atmosphere, a primary cause of climate change. Next slide. Literally, First Nations settled along the shores of the Great Lakes and Detroit River because of the access to water and what the benefits of wetlands. Next slide. But we have impacted the wetlands dramatically by our human use of the Detroit River and our abuse of the Detroit River. And here is an example of building the Livingstone channel of the Detroit River, about a 5-mile channel where literally limestone was dynamited and removed from the river to create a 21 to 23 foot shipping channel in the river. Not only did this destroy spawning habitat for rock-loving, lithophilic spawning fishes, but it also destroyed wetlands. Next slide. Also, pollution. Here are some slides on the upper left-hand corner, the confluence of the Rouge River and Detroit River, and you can see some pollution and raw sewage coming in. The upper right-hand corner, you see not only the confluence with the Detroit and Rouge rivers, but you see a conical shaped plume, which is the submerged discharge pipe of the Detroit wastewater treatment plant, the largest single site wastewater treatment plant in the United States. On the bottom here, you see the last remaining photo of the Rouge River when it caught on fire in 1969. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of combined sewer overflows that are so common in old urban areas like Detroit. And during wet weather, it can bring in both raw sewage, stormwater, but raw sewage from that does not go to the wastewater treatment plant for treatment. Next slide, please. At one time here in 1815, wetlands would extend up to a mile inland along the Detroit River. But, you know, think of all the people that came to Detroit, all the industry that followed, and we filled the shoreline, we hardened it, and there has now been a 97% loss of coastal wetland habitat on the Detroit River. And those little black polygons on the right-hand figure shows you what remains from since 1815. Next slide, please. And of course, Detroit River is one of 43 Great Lakes areas of concern identified in the 1980s by the International Joint Commission. And one of the things that the Remedial Action Plan program has been trying to do is restore fish and wildlife habitat, including coastal wetlands. Next slide, please. It's interesting that through the RAP program, these green areas on here are some of the habitat restoration projects undertaken through the RAP, like Blue Heron Lagoon, Lake Okanoka, Stony, Humbug Marsh, and Celeron Island. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of Humbug Marsh, the last mile of natural shoreline on the U.S. mainland of the Detroit River. The upper photo is a photo taken by the Friends of the Detroit River and who were instrumental, along with others like Detroit Audubon, Sierra Club, and many other citizens to save Humbug Marsh from development. Next slide, please. It's a very unique place. There's an international convention, like a treaty, called the Ramsar Convention that identifies wetlands of international importance, not national, not state or provincial, not regional, but international. There are 2,200 throughout the world, 41 in the United States, and only one in Michigan, and that's Humbug Marsh. Next slide. It has bald eagles. It has 2 dragonfly species, elusive clubtail and russet-tipped clubtail, that are Michigan species of special concern. It has the eastern fox snake that is threatened in Michigan. It has a native Michigan orchid called oval ladies' tresses that is threatened and has a coefficient of conservation of 9. 10 would be pre-settlement conditions. So 9 is exceptionally high. It has a rare sedge called the hairy fruited sedge that is a special concern species in Michigan, and its coefficient of conservation is 8 on a scale of 10. Next slide, please. The property just north of the Humbug Marsh was a former automotive brake and paint plant site. For 44 years, it operated, and then it became an industrial brownfield and sat. In the saving of Humbug Marsh, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Wayne County acquired that land to become the gateway to the International Wildlife Refuge. So they have now cleaned up that land, restored habitats for the visitor center. Next slide, please. In total, 16 acres of wetlands have been restored on that site. And again, this is an area that has lost 97% of its coastal wetland habitat. 25 acres of upland buffer habitat have been restored. Phragmites has been controlled on 2.5 miles of shoreline, and invasive species have been controlled on 50 acres of upland habitats. Next slide, please. Humbug Marsh and the Refuge Gateway are now open 4 days a week, Thursday through Sunday, in daylight hours. It is an amazing place. The visitor center is not open and will not open until the COVID pandemic is over. Next slide, please. I would like to now turn it over to Greg Norwood.
Hey everyone. Yeah, thank you for joining us, and thanks John for that. I'll just speak a few minutes very briefly on an example of wetland, there's a few examples coming up of actually restoring coastal wetlands that were damaged or destroyed. And so one example is the southeast end of Belle Isle in Detroit, Michigan. And this is an area that's been getting a tremendous amount of attention because of the opportunity there to restore damaged coastal wetlands. And it's a place where so many people can see it and be a part of the restoration. I'll speak a little bit here on Lake Okanoka, which is the site circled in red. Sam will take over from there and talk a little bit more on the Blue Heron Lagoon. But it's all one system that is being restored. And of course, a part of that is that big green spot there in the center of your screen, and that's the Flatwoods, the Wet Music Flatwoods Forest. And that's a very important part of the restoration of this part of the Detroit River. Next slide, please. All right, this gives you an idea of what we mean by coastal wetland restoration. Pictures speak 1,000 words. So what you're seeing here is reconnection of not just water, not just the hydrology from the Detroit River water to the wetlands once again. As you can see on the lower right, Sam will talk a little bit more about this, but that used to be closed off. And so the Detroit River water could not flow through the Blue Heron Lagoon. On the upper left is the Lake Okanoka. And that also was separated a number of decades ago, and water from the Detroit River could not flow. But it's not just about restoring connection of water, it's all the life that is reconnected once you get the water moving back into these wetlands. And so there are huge benefits to the ecosystem, and thus, like what John said, us. And it's an exciting area to visit. You can do it during after the end of the pandemic and see all the benefits. But I would say there's also a couple of neat projects around here as well that also restore parts of the ecosystem. Lake Sturgeon Walleye Spawning Reef, just upstream of these efforts. And you can see in the image here the 200-acre Flatwoods Forest that also requires restoration because of some damage over many decades to the hydrology. So next slide, please. And I'll just wrap up and turn it over to Sam in just a moment. I would like to point out the benefits to, John mentioned birds, but fish. One of the most important parts of Lake Okanoka is its improvement and direct addition of about 25 acres of habitat for numerous fish. So, you know, if you look at some of the fish that fishermen are interested in catching, or people who like to fish, northern pike, muskie, walleye, smallmouth bass will absolutely benefit from this reconnection. And then they need food. Those game fish need food to eat. And so we know that this reconnection will benefit emerald, spot-tail, sand, common and striped shiner, blunt-nosed minnow, and rock bass, sunfish, bluegills. It's all being reconnected in a huge benefit. So that's it for me. I'll turn it over to Sam to talk a little bit more about the Blue Heron Lagoon, which is what's above on the top of your screen. Thanks. Sam.
Sorry, everyone. It's that mute button again. But Greg, yeah, thanks for pointing out how the Blue Heron Lagoon is integral with the Lake Okanoka project, and also the fact that this area was a coastal wetland as little as a little over 50 years ago. Actually, it was about 1952, a short lifetime ago, when this entire area was a coastal wetland. And it was that way for 10,000 years, you know, from the beginning of, since the glacial period, is how this existed as a coastal wetland. So it was really only a brief period where Lake Okanoka was isolated from the Detroit River. And now, as of just last week, that project has opened up and reconnected. The Blue Heron Lagoon Habitat Restoration Project was championed by Friends of the Detroit River for the Detroit River Public Advisory Council. This project opened the lagoon to the Detroit River, allowing what was an isolated, stagnating water body to become a sanctuary for Great Lakes fish spawning and nursery activity. You can think of it as the first phase to the Lake Okanoka project just described by Greg. Next slide. This is a rendering of the project. The dredged material from the new opening was used to create a new peninsula hosting a turtle nesting area and vernal pools for use by a variety of reptiles and amphibians. Some of the material was placed next to the peninsula to create an emergent wetland with native aquatic plantings. This was flanked by a gravel fish spawning bed. Next slide. City of Detroit high school students assisted in planting the area with native materials, taking great pride in being part of a significant environmental enhancement project. Next. The following summer, the results of their labor flourished and became teeming with the intended inhabitants. In addition to the benefits gained by wildlife, the Belle Isle Nature Center makes use of the site for programs to engage young people with nature study throughout the summer. Next. Even with the high water experienced over the past 2 years, this opening and other enhancements associated with the project have greatly improved wildlife habitat in the lagoon and were the first step in creating nearly 70 acres of calm backwater for fish spawning and nursery activity. This new refuge formed by the lagoon and Lake Okanoka are reminiscent of the coastal wetland that existed a little over 100 years ago on the south shore of Belle Isle. Next slide. The Hennepin Marsh Restoration Project is still in the planning phase, but implementation could begin as early as next year. Located in the north end of the Trenton Channel between Grosse Ile and the mainland, the project falls on 2 sites. The sites are on both sides of the Bridge Road, or what is known as the Grosse Ile Toll Bridge. Next slide. The project sites take on similar design concepts, which rely on the construction of rock shoals to protect the sensitive nearshore coastal wetland from further degradation by ice flows, storm wave, and freighter wake. In addition, the shoals enhance habitat within surrounding waters by providing structure for small fish to take cover from predators. In the North Marsh site, a series of shoals are proposed to extend south from Hennepin Point for about 1,500 feet. Various design styles shown on the right will be incorporated, targeted to attract many forms of wildlife such as fish, pollinating insects, migratory birds, shorebirds, including the endangered tern. Next slide. At the south site, the shoals are primarily placed to rebuild former shoal islands that have nearly eroded away. Watch for the potential advancement of this project, at least the south site, next year. Next slide. Moving on to Stony and Celeron Island. The design of the Hennepin Marsh habitat shoals were informed by successes achieved by the Stony and Celeron Island restoration projects, where similar rock structures were constructed to protect and enhance sensitive coastal wetlands. Near the mouth of the Detroit River, Stony Island is a 100-acre uninhabited island sitting between Grosse Ile and the Livingston Channel. Celeron Island is 80 acres, also uninhabited, and located between the lower end of Grosse Ile extending into Lake Erie. Both islands are owned by the state of Michigan, managed by the Point Mouillet State Game Area, and have seen several severe habitat loss due to fluctuations in high water levels, wave-driven erosion, and the impacts of invasive plants. Grant funding for both projects came to Friends of the Detroit River from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative administered by NOAA. Bob Burns will provide you with some project details. Take it away, Bob. Next slide.
Thank you, Sam. Stony Island is comprised of two wetland areas, the North Bay and the South Bay. Each were protected by a man-made dike that over time had eroded and in places no longer provided protection for the wetland behind them. The dark lines in the construction drawing shows the location of the new shoals that were constructed, along with all of the new habitat features listed on the right side of the slide. Next slide. On the right side of the slide, you can see the completed shoals now protecting the North Bay wetlands from current and wave action. The lower section of shoals also provides a stopover, resting, and potential nesting area for local and migratory shorebirds. Rebuilding the South Bay shoals now protects the entire south side of the island's wetlands. It also includes a vegetative emergent area that provides plants for pollinators and berry-bearing bushes for migratory birds. Next slide. Since the completion of the new shoals at Stony, we have seen a lot of activity on them, from a large nesting colony of great blue herons, a pair of nesting eagles and their offspring, as well as many fish species and amphibians like mud puppies. Next slide. The shoals at Celeron Island were constructed in a manner similar to what was completed at Stony. Along the southern end of the island, a series of overlapping shoals were built to protect the southern end of the island from the wave action and erosive effects from Lake Erie. At the northeastern side of the island, over 1,800 feet of shoal was reconstructed or reinforced to protect the wetlands in the inner bay of the island. The bullet points reflect the amount of shoreline protected, shoals built, and number and kind of habitat structures added to this site. Next slide. In this slide, you can see how extensive the shoal system is at the south end of the island. The shoal on the left side of the slide shows our emergent shoal that contains a slope beach on the inside with emergent habitat logs and plants and shrubs on the top, similar to that seen at Stony. To the right of the slide, you can see the irregular shaped shoal that was designed to provide roosting and nesting areas for local and migratory shorebirds. Next slide. Here you can see the construction of the new stone shoal along the length of the northeast side of the island, where the original tree-lined shoal area in the 2013 picture had completely washed out. Note the opening left in the shoal to allow for fresh water and fish to pass through and into the bay. Next slide. Protecting and providing new habitat for wildlife, and particularly for fish species, is a primary goal of our habitat restoration projects. In this slide, you can see a couple of large smallmouth bass establishing nests on the fish spawning gravel, placed at the foot of the North Island Shoal. Fish and amphibians have taken advantage of all of our habitat features installed at the site, as well as in the rocky crevices contained within the shoals themselves. Now I'd like to turn it over to Terry.
Thanks, Bob. Well, given all the work that was just described that is being done, what do we expect the climate to do in the future here? Of course, this is a somewhat of a guessing game, but there are those out there that are more experienced than a biologist like me. But some of the things they're talking about are that these frequent and intense storms will probably continue, and that we should expect water levels to be on the high side of normal in the Great Lakes. In fact, there was a webinar a couple of weeks ago, the Corps of Engineers, NOAA, and the Weather Service combined to talk about a forecast for like the next 6 months. And that was what I got out of that webinar, was that, in fact, We are seeing water levels go down a little bit in the Great Lakes, but they're not going to go back to what we used to think of as normal. They're going to be on the high side of that. So with these conditions, we're expecting structures along the shoreline, man-made structures like seawalls, riprap, and those sorts of things to be degraded, especially when water levels are higher than they may have been designed for. And we can probably expect our coastal wetlands that are out there to be degraded. Next slide, please. So a study done by some research done by the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Group, they looked at trends going back to 1951 until 2017. So over this 66-year period of time, they saw that average temperature went up over 2 degrees over that time, and that frost-free days that season was extended by 16 days over those sort of 66 years. And precipitation went up 14%, as well as the number of events, the heavy precipitation events, that went up by 35%. So that is definitely showing a trend for higher water levels, perhaps more intense storms, and warmer conditions. Next slide, please. Here's a little cross-section that Sam prepared actually through Belle Isle, but it shows a trend here as well, more of a local trend. If you look at the right-hand side of that, you'll see at 95-foot elevation, and this is based on the City of Detroit datum, in August of 2011, that's where the water level was. We go to 2015 again in August, and the water level was a foot higher, or approximately a foot higher. Now, if you go to July of last year, the water elevation was at 98.53, which is above the 100-year flood. Now, that did come back in September, but it does show an increase in water elevations on in a local area on like a shorter scale than what I was just talking about in the previous slide. Next slide, please. So, given all this, what can we do about it? Well, I'll provide a couple examples here, but others will follow me with some others regarding what might be recommended, including using what we have learned with some of the projects. Some of the projects Bob just described, we've learned a lot to accommodate the high water levels. How can we incorporate that into future projects? How do we enhance and strengthen the resiliency of those wetlands that are out there right now? And I would add, how do we do that with those wetlands we're also restoring? And perhaps adopting the Lake Erie Biodiversity Conservation Strategy goal of, by 2030, increasing wetlands out there to 25% of their historical area. And I think John's going to talk a little more about that. And how do we incorporate maybe some man-made infrastructure into those new coastal wetlands that we're restoring? So next slide, please. This is an example from Muskegon Lake, actually, but it really shows well how an existing shoreline was graded with a very gentle slope so that, and it was planted with vegetation that can tolerate, types of vegetation that can tolerate being flooded, and those that maybe tolerate a little drier conditions. With that combination of vegetation, you can see when the water level on the lower left is low, the area is still entirely vegetated. And in those areas that are wetter, there's vegetation adapted for that. The photo on the lower right, under high water conditions, again, it's still vegetated, but those plants that are adapted to those water levels can still exist. Next slide, please. And in those areas, and I believe this is from the St. Clair River. So it's an area where there's not a lot of room to make a real gentle slope, but it's also an area that receives a high energy of like the wave energy from ship traffic, storm events, etc. So this was incorporating rock into a vegetated shoreline so that we still have the habitat value of the vegetation, but there's a little harder infrastructure to keep everything in place. Next slide. Another thing that is being done on a local community scale is, for instance, Windsor and across the river in Detroit, both these cities have created climate action plans. So they're taking the effects of climate change seriously and trying to plan for that. One other organization that many of you are probably already aware of or probably part of, St. Clair Detroit River System Initiative. And that's a group of academics, scientists, resource agencies, local governments, all with an interest in this corridor of the Great Lakes. And one of the things that adopted as their as a priority objective is that Lake Erie biodiversity goal for increasing the coastal wetlands. With that, I'm going to pass this on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Terry. Being able to adapt to rapid changes in the environment was a key in the success of the design and implementation of the resulting shoal construction work done at both Stony and Celeron Island. The newspaper photo on the left of Celeron was taken in the early 1970s. Notice a large enclosed cattail wetland along the southeast side of the island and the fully intact outer perimeter shoal or dike that runs around the entire east side and all the way up to the north end. The color photo on the right was taken in 2013, about the time the project design and construction plans were being developed. As you can see by then, the entire cattail wetland on the outer perimeter shoal is gone at the lower end of the island. This was due to high water that occurred and erosion in the 1970s and again in the 1990s. You can see that the perimeter shoal is still intact, running up the northeast side of the island, other than a small opening on the very upper end. You can also see quite a bit of protected cattail growth and emergent vegetation still remaining behind the shoal in the enclosed bay area. Next slide. In the spring of 2019, after the completion of the work at Stony and seeing the record high water levels that we were experiencing at the time, we realized that we were going to have to make some additional modifications to the construction plan in order to replace over 900 feet of the existing shoal that had completely washed away, and since the initial design was completed, and stabilizing an additional 900 feet of the remaining tree-lined dike that ran from the new stone replacement shoal south. Next slide. In the picture on the left, you can see that the tree-lined shoal is overtopping with water and is in the process of completely washing out. This required the placement of a line of armor stone along the outside of the shoal. And in the photo on the right that was taken this fall, you can see where we had placed a new armor stone along the edge of the existing shoal, which helped in stabilizing the shoreline and provided some erosion protection, allowing for new emergent growth to fill in behind the shoal and even further strengthening the shoreline. All of these changes, and there were many, would not have been possible without the flexibility of our partnership, which allowed our team to redesign the shoal, obtain rapid approvals, and make the necessary changes that resulted in the execution of a successful project. Now I'd like to turn it back over to John.
Thanks, Bob. So much. Terry mentioned that the Lake Erie Biodiversity Conservation Strategy was developed under the leadership of the Nature Conservancy, but it was truly a binational effort, and it was under the purview of the Lake-wide Management Plan for Lake Erie. But it seeks to come up with specific strategies and actions to protect and conserve native biodiversity in Lake Erie. Next slide, please. As Terry mentioned, in there, it has set a quantitative target, a measurable goal for the Detroit River And it says by 2030, coastal wetlands in the Detroit River will comprise at least 25% of their historical area. Well, you'll remember that we lost 97% of our coastal wetland habitat. So currently, based on National Wetlands Inventory data, they show that 56 hectares of connected wetlands remain. That means that the Detroit River would have to achieve a net gain of 452 hectares of coastal wetlands over the next decade. We have a long ways to go, and we have much to do. I'll turn it over now to Sam.
Thanks, John. And I want everybody to know we're starting to run short on time, so this is our last point of discussion. I'll try to blip through it quick. So yes, you've seen in our earlier segments of this presentation that a lot of great work has been done in the Detroit River to restore coastal wetlands that existed during pre-settlement times. But we have a lot of work to do in reaching the goal that John just spoke about, that being that by 2030, coastal wetlands in the Detroit River will comprise at least 25% of their historical area. And in the meantime, the normal range for what we know as low and high water in the Detroit River could be trending higher due to climate change. As we work toward the binational coastal wetland goal, one of our greatest challenges could come if destruction along our coastlines begin to create extreme emergency situations, to the point where saving or rebuilding man-made infrastructure becomes our only focus. Here is where it will be important to remember the process that brought us to a state of emergency in the first place. So starting at the top of this graphic with hardened shoreline development, this leads to a decline of green infrastructure, which stimulates climate change, and on to high water levels that cause destruction of hardened shorelines, which results in new investment to save hardened shorelines, and then back to more hardened shoreline development, which starts the whole process over again, but probably from a point that is worse than it is today. So here is where we need to recognize the importance of rebuilding lost coastal wetlands and protecting those that exist simultaneously with infrastructure protection projects. Having the right people involved in future planning and policy-making decisions is critical to this process. Next. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope this was informative. Now let's bring back Bindu and Eric, who have a little more info and will lead our question and answer session. Next.
Well, thank you very much for that great presentation. If our presenters would like to put themselves up, turn on their videos. I'm going to now ask a few questions. So if you have, there some questions already in the chat. If you have more questions, please write them in. So first question, has anyone looked at the impact of seawalls along the river? I moved into a house on Grosse Ile in 1984 along the Elba Canal. Most people did not have seawalls then. Now nearly everyone does, and you can see animals, birds, turtles use the few natural shorelines that are left. Are there solutions or ongoing education regarding this?
Eric, I'll take that. It's John. You know, you can imagine much of the Detroit River shoreline is hardened with concrete breakwaters and steel sheet piling. Concrete breakwaters and steel sheet piling has no habitat value. So, you know, clearly we need that where we're going to bring in ships, where, you know, for certain industrial purposes. But in other places, we don't need them. We can make the shoreline just as safe, just as stable. We can enhance habitat. We can make it more aesthetically pleasing and potentially even save some money. And that's called soft shoreline engineering. And that's been demonstrated on both sides of the river in approximately 50 different locations. think of a good place like Elizabeth Park, where the old 1910 breakwater was torn out and 2 oxbows and soft shoreline were put in place. So that's the simple answer.
And I would just add, if there's if they want to have some education on natural shorelines, the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership has a website, so you can put that into Google. Although that's a little different from this system, it can at least give you some examples of what a soft shoreline can look like on residential properties. This is a comment, but if anyone would like to make a comment on this comment, more marshes in Southeast Michigan should be on the Ramsar list. Salt River Marsh on Lake St. Clair comes to mind. Does anyone have any comments on that?
Hearing no one, Eric, I'll take, I guess, that one too. Yeah, so we only have one in Michigan, Humbug Marsh, but on the St. Clair Flats, on the Canadian side, that is a Ramsar wetland of international importance. So my feeling is, yes, we should identify more wetlands of international importance through Ramsar to give attention to this important issue and to develop community-based stewardship programs for wetlands.
Okay, next question. What is the DNR doing to address invasive species at State Park and State Park and State Game areas down in Monroe? And how is climate change affecting these areas?
Yeah, I'll take that question, and thanks for it. There's been a lot of effort to consider how to protect these places and restore them in light of invasive species. Phragmites, obviously is one that comes to mind that lots of organizations, including the DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, Nature Conservancy, has worked very hard to prioritize areas and reduce their abundance. As far as any one given place, Point Mouillet is one. I don't know if that was part of the question, but Phragmites control has been going on for many years, and it's ongoing. And so, I think the challenge, just to be brief, is to recognize that they are a part of our system, unless we can get to the point where we can eradicate early invasions. But things like Phragmites, we have to understand that they're always going to be somewhere in the landscape, and so we need to maximize the functionality of the wetlands that we restore, and recognize that if we can control them to some degree, or to build these kinds of restorations so that their impact is less, that's really what we're thinking a lot about.
Great, thanks, Greg. Okay, given that Detroit sits south of the hinge point for isostatic rebound, what factor needs to be added in for the gradual but eventual continued sinking of this part of the Great Lakes coast in wetland design and the placement of infrastructure? Big question.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. I think planning horizons would be one. Quite frequently we have opportunistic short-term planning, and we don't plan out on long timescales, but that's clearly one thing we can do. Better long-term planning and clearly monitoring programs. As we all know, monitoring programs have been cut on both sides of the border, and so we need to make sure there's monitoring in place. There's good modeling for changes and projections, and then planning on an appropriate time scale to be able to address those kinds of issues.
Okay, I would like to add, so this our webinar is technically over at 1. However, we've asked our presenters to stay on a little bit longer. So if you do have questions, you can continue to ask them, and we'll try to get to them within this time period. Okay. Next question. Been out with the Huron Watershed Council monitoring the creeks and streams downriver. Many creeks have experienced reverse flow at the outlets to the rivers during the spring due to the higher water levels. Is this going to be an ongoing trend? What is the impact on upstream watersheds, and what can be done to address this?
Gary, you're the guy with the trends. I don't know if you want to jump on.
Yeah,
that.
well, that is a great question. I mean, the trends do indicate higher water levels, so I would expect that to continue to be an issue. But I think there is a lot more work on green infrastructure up in the watersheds to control the water actually coming into the creeks. So, and to release that water in a slower way. That's kind of interesting because I'm used to looking at ways to open up streams to waterways, and I've not even, to be honest, I have thought about water backing up and what that impact could be. I'm not a hydrologist, so there's my biology response.
Just a real lofty answer to that, to the whole idea of what we just talked about with climate change being brought on by a number of things, but one in particular, the loss of coastal wetlands. Over time, if worldwide, we can do something about climate change, and it would mitigate some of these intense storms. That's the big answer, is how do we reverse our course, and at least how do we stop it from getting worse. So this just gets back to how important coastal wetlands are in the bigger planning process, and how we need to be consciously thinking about incorporating them in everything we do along our shorelines.
Well,
Sam, this mitigation and adaptation, right? So mitigate carbon coming into the atmosphere, City Detroit, City of Windsor have climate action plans, and the City of Detroit bought into the Paris Accord and trying to live up to the targets for reducing carbon inputs. Even Windsor identified the City of Windsor is in a climate crisis, and so that they want to heighten awareness of that we need to mitigate and then adapt. And adapt to climate change is we need to build green infrastructure. We need to do things, like that to adapt to more extreme, increasing frequency and intensity of storms and more water.
Thank you. I'm looking through our list right now. Bindu has been putting out for everybody all of our presenters' contacts and other information there, so feel free to grab those resources. One more question here, and it's to do with connectivity again. Regarding the lagoon and lake on Belle Isle, aren't these areas now threatened by the possible long-term flooding? Would it be eventually necessary to close these back off to save these parts of the island itself?
Sure.
Yeah, other folks can jump in. Yeah, the exceptionally high water has made it difficult to finish the Lake Okanoka restoration. And it also jeopardizes the long-term viability of the trees in parts of the flatwoods. And so there is currently intended to be a temporary stop, a disconnection from the Blue Heron Lagoon to Lake Okanoka using this huge bladder that's out there. That is temporary. And so that's a stopgap measure to get through these really high water levels. We also have a stop log structure on the other side of that Lake Okanoka that can disconnect that coastal wetland. That is not what we want to do in the long term, but is something we can do as a stopgap measure to get through these high water levels. Hopefully they will come down over time.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Greg, that we all work together. When I say we, everybody on that project worked together on the timing of those structures. When do we think it's a good time to put them in place? So we've looked at that, and we've coordinated that with the fisheries folks as well, because we see this as a fisheries project, and we want to do everything to keep it a fisheries project. So we're trying to work with everything we're dealt with here and trying to come up with the best solution for the fisheries, but recognizing that there are times when infrastructure on that island is at risk. So yeah, we're balancing a lot of things there.
One more thing to add, which kind of relates to what Bob Burns was talking about with adaptive management during construction. This unprecedented high water level in the Detroit River hit us in the middle of that project's construction. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody, you can't predict these kinds of things. So it was we had to act really what was extremely quickly to come up with these strategies for temporary water control. Those things don't happen overnight. This is like, we have engineers involved, we have permitting approvals, all those things that had to happen very quickly in order to get these temporary measures in place, which what we see right now, we got them in place. They're going to be there for a couple of months, and then they're coming right back out as we see the water coming back down. So we're excited to see that the goals of this project will be coming to fruition very soon.
Well, as we are at over time here, a couple minutes, I wanted to thank Sam, Bob, John, Terry, and Greg. I have a little short list here to make sure I don't forget anybody, and the Friends of the Detroit River for hosting this program today. Like we said, there will be a lot of resources shared, as well as the the link to the recording in a future email. And I just wanted to give you a plug for an upcoming program on December 8th that will give you more information about Belle Isle, restoration efforts on Belle Isle to mitigate climate change. So Sam and our speakers, Sam and Greg today, will be presenting there. So look for that in the chat, and also we'll give you information on how to sign up for that. Thank you so much to everybody, all the speakers. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Bindu and Eric.